وبارك وسلم. ما بعد, السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. Yesterday we were talking about Isra'iliyat and if they can be used in Tafseer of Quran or not, and the answer is yes, they can, and the ijazah and permission has been given by Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. He says in a hadith which is authentic, narrated by Imam Bukhari, "Hadithu an Bani Israel wala haraj." You can narrate from Banu Israel, you don't have to worry about it. But then we went into some detail regarding the fact that you can't narrate every single thing. And if you do narrate certain things, there has to be some caveats to it. For instance, if you're narrating something that goes against our beliefs, then the only reason you should be narrating such a thing is to expose it and not to utilize it for beliefs. And so he gave plenty of examples of aspects of using from Banu Israel. And Imam Ibn Kathir, he mentioned that most of these are not necessary. They're not certain essential aspects of your deen. All essential portions of our deen that we need to know for guidance, for hidayah, for life on earth is already mentioned in Quran and Sunnah. So you don't really need it. It's just for an added benefit of details. So certain details can be taken from the Banu Israel. He also mentioned the adab in doing so, the etiquette in mentioning the narrations of Banu Israel, and he takes it from an ayah from Surah Al-Kahf where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions 3 different opinions as to how many were the people of the cave, and were they 3 and the 4th being the dog, were they 5, the 6th being the dog, or were they 7, the 8th being the dog. In this ayah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala states, he points towards the first 2 opinions being weak, and then regarding the 3rd one, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala doesn't say anything. So he says this is an etiquette. You have to mention all the opinions that are out there because there's difference of opinion among their scholars, Jews and Christians. So because you have so many variations in their books, right? We only have one Quran. And there's different qira'at, but there's no differences in the ayah, right? You'll have like Maliki Yawmiddin, but it doesn't change the meaning really. They have completely different stories. So there's a whole difference of opinion that contradict one another in the same book. So Matthew, Luke, John, etc., those brothers who are acquainted with that, they'll see the same story being mentioned one place, mentioned in another place, but worded differently, and it's a contradiction as well. It's not just a different wording, it's a whole contradiction. So these are different opinions. So Imam Ibn Kathir says the method of mentioning these types of things is to mention all of them, meaning mention all the different opinions. Don't just mention one opinion and leave out the others. Because you might think that I'm mentioning the one that's correct, whereas another one was correct. And some other scholar can come and say, no, the other one's actually correct for such and such reason. Now, if you just left it out and only mentioned one, you've mentioned the weaker one and you didn't mention the stronger one. So he says you should not do that. So that's what he's going to talk about here. He says, as for the individual who mentions the differences of opinion regarding some issue, but he didn't mention all of the opinions. So let's say there is a story in the Injil or the Bible. It's in Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. It's in all of them. He only mentions Matthew. He didn't mention anyone else. So Ibn Kathir is saying he's doing wrong here. He should mention all of them and then say which one his opinion is leaning towards as to what is the correct one. He says doing this is incorrect because of the reason that I mentioned. You might think that you're stating the correct one, and you're actually not doing so. Then he says, if you purposefully knew that the one that you're mentioning, you're not mentioning all of them, you chose one, and you feel like this is not the most sahih, then you're actually a liar. Because you know that this story is in all of the different books, and you didn't mention all the different opinions, and you chose one that you don't think is correct. And you never said that, I think this is incorrect. Then he says you're actually a liar. Or if you did this by mistake, then you are a jahil. You're ignorant. So he's saying that you shouldn't be engaged in tafsir at all. And he goes on a little bit about this in terms of details, but I'm going to skip over that. And then he mentions a narration. He says Ibn Abbas, when he was asked about something, فَكَانَ فِي الْقُرْآنِ قَالَ بِهِ. If Ibn Abbas was asked about something that is in the Quran, he would tell you. If it wasn't in the Quran, but there was a hadith about it, he will tell you the hadith. And if there is no, the information is not in Quran, it's not in hadith, but Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu knew about it, or he did it, then he would tell you about Abu Bakr. And if Abu Bakr didn't talk about it, then he would use his own opinion. So what is he saying here? He's saying the method of Ibn Abbas in Tafseer was, you ask him a question about a certain ayah. If it's in the Quran, he'll tell you, okay, this ayah is explained here in more detail. This ayah. Then he'll give you the Quran, and that's all. If it's not in the Quran, but it's in the hadith, he'll tell you the hadith. And if it's not in the hadith, then he would resort to Abu Bakr, because Abu Bakr knew more than anyone else. So this is the third thing in our terms of how we do tafsir. We go to the statements of Sahaba. So he would go to Abu Bakr's statement. So if Abu Bakr said something about it, Ibn Abbas would say it. And if he finds nothing with Abu Bakr, he would use his own judgment. Right? But he wouldn't go to Ahlul Kitab because he didn't really have access at that time. Now Imam bin Kathir, he goes on to talk about tafsir of tabi'een. So we talked about tafsir of Quran, using Quran through hadith, through statements of Sahaba, and even Banu Israel. Now he goes into number 5. We talked about 4 methods of tafsir. This is number 5, tabi'een. So he says, if you don't find tafsir of this ayah, you're looking at an ayah, you don't find it anywhere else in the Quran explained in more detail. You don't find it in the Sunnah. You don't find any Sahabi talking about either. So just no one's talking about this. And of course, not with the Ahlul Kitab. He says many Imams have went to the opinions of tabi'een. Some Imams have done this. This is not compulsory. So he's saying some people have gone to the tabi'een, some people have not. And he'll explain a little bit in more detail as to why. So he says, for instance, Mujahid bin Jabr. There was a tabi'i, his name was Mujahid bin Jabr, and he says, فَإِنَّهُ كَانَ آيَةً فِي التَّفْسِيرِ. People used to marvel at him when it came to his tafsir. He was really good at tafsir. He was a student of Ibn Abbas, Mujahid. Ibn Abbas had many students. So Ibn Abbas is like the greatest mufassir. We talked about Ibn Abbas earlier. He had many students. Among his best students was Mujahid bin Jabr. And there's a narration. Mujahid says, عَرَضْتُ الْمُصْحَفَ عَلَى ابْنِ عَبَّاسِ ثَلَاثَ عَرَضَاتٍ. I studied Quran with Ibn Abbas 3 full khatams. So I studied with him the tafsir once, we finished. I started again, we finished. I started again, we finished. So he did tafsir with Ibn Abbas 3 full times. مِنْ فَاتِحَتِهِ إِلَى خَاتِمَتِهِ. From Surah Fatiha to Surah An-Nas. Mujahid did the whole tafsir with Ibn Abbas. أوقفه عند كل آية منه وأسأله عنها. For every ayah of the Quran, he said, I would stop Ibn Abbas and I would ask him, what does this ayah mean? What do we learn from the ayah? You just go deep into every ayah. He doesn't say every surah, he said every single ayah of the Quran. I would stop him and I wouldn't allow ourselves to go further in the recitation until I fully understood it. He did this 3 times. So he really knows his tafsir, and he's a tabi'i. Another narration, Ibn Abi Mulaika says, I saw Mujahid asking Ibn Abbas about tafsir. He had tablets with him. So they didn't have like books like we do. They used to have alwah, like tablets. So he used to like write on these tablets. فَيَقُولُ لَهُ ابْنُ عَبَّاسِ اُكْتُبْ. Ibn Abbas would tell Mujahid, write down. And he would write. حَتَّى سَأَلَهُ عَنِ التَّفْسِيرِ كُلِّهِ. And he did this for the whole Quran. So imagine how many tablets he must have had. The whole Quran, every single ayah of the Quran. There's thousands of ayahs. So for everything he wrote something. Ibn Abbas would tell him, write. And he's doing it from his memory and from his knowledge. ولهذا كان سفيان الثوري يقول إذا جاءك التفسير عن مجاهد فحسبك به. Sufyan al-Thawri is a mujtahid, really great scholar in the past. He says, if you get a tafsir from Mujahid, that's enough. So Mujahid says something, take it. That's what he says about it. There's many tabi'een like this, and he's going to mention some names. So he says another tabi'i, Sa'id bin Jubair, or Ikrima, Mawla ibn Abbas. Ikrima was the servant of Ibn Abbas, his slave. He set him free eventually, but he would teach him. I can't remember reading this, but I think someone told me about this. Ibn Abbas would chain him, and he would force him to learn. So he would chain him down, and maybe he was a boy at the time, so he wanted to play, but he wouldn't let him play, and he would force him to learn tafsir. Ata bin Abi Rabah, great Mufti of Mecca as well, Hassan al-Basri, Masruq bin al-Ajda', Sa'id bin al-Musayyib, the son-in-law of Abu Huraira, Abu al-Aliya, al-Rabi' bin Anas, Qatada, Dhahak bin Muzahim, and other tabi'een. These are very famous tabi'ees. Anyone studying tafsir would definitely come across their names. وَتَابِعِيهِمْ, and then أَتْبَعُ tabi'een as well. This is the third generation. So we can take tafsir from the tabi'een, we can take them from أَتْبَعُ tabi'een, the third generation as well. It says فَتُذْكَرُ أَقْوَالُهُمْ فِي الْآيَةِ. You can mention what they had to say about an ayah. So especially in certain tafsirs really go deep into this. Imam Ibn Jarir's tafsir is very large. He quotes all of this extensively. So then he says, sometimes you'll find differences of opinion with them. So the tabi'een, they're mentioning something, they will differ. فيحسبها من لا علم عنده اختلافا فيحكيها أقوالا وليس كذلك وإن منهم من يعبر عن الشيء بلازمه أو بنظيره ومنهم من ينص على الشيء بعينه والكل بمعنى واحد في كثير من الأماكن فليتفطن اللبيب لذلك والله الهادي. So basically what he's saying here is there's another thing the mufassir has to be aware of when you're dealing with the tabi'een. So the tabi'een, they learn something from Sahaba. Right? Now you have different generations of tabi'een. Imam Abu Hanifa was a tabi'i as well, but he only saw like very few Sahaba. This is the last of the tabi'een. We're talking about the major tabi'een who were around Sahaba. Their teachers are Sahaba. So Ibn Kathir is saying, sometimes each one will have a different tafsir. So I like to use the example because everyone knows Surah Fatiha, Siratul Mustaqim, Ihdina Siratul Mustaqim, guide us to the straight path. What does that mean? One tabi'i will say it's Quran. The other tabi'in will say it's Islam. The other tabi'i says it's taqwa. There's all these different opinions. So, and they're getting it from Sahaba. How are they differing so much? So he's saying here, the person who doesn't know tafsir so well, he'll think of them as contradictory. In reality, they're not contradictory at all. What happened is Ibn Abbas perhaps taught all of them. Many of these were the students of Ibn Abbas. And he taught them what Sirat Mustaqim is. They have the meaning in their minds. The way they state that meaning comes out in different forms. So maybe Ibn Abbas told them Sirat Mustaqim is the deen, is Islam. So some said, okay, Quran is Islam. So I'm going to say it's Quran. Some say, okay, it's deen instead of Islam. They phrase it differently. So it's not a difference of opinion, really. It's the same thing. So Ibn Kathir is saying that a person should be very cautious of this and understand when they do that. I'm going to do one more paragraph and we'll pause, inshallah. This is interesting. Imam Shu'bah, he's another tabi'i. He says the statements, and this is the objection to this whole thing. Can you use the statements of a tabi'i for tafsir? So Shu'bah says when it comes to fiqh, we don't use the statements of tabi'in. It's not a hujjah, it's not a proof. In fiqh, we use the statements of Sahaba. Right? Sahaba statements counts in fiqh. Like if you don't have a hadith, you don't have an ayah, but a Sahabi said something about fiqh, you'll choose some Sahaba over others. But tabi'een, we don't really use them. Then when it comes to after Sahaba, the Imams will just use their own opinion. They won't mention tabi'een. So Shurba, he says, when it comes to fiqh, we don't use tabi'een. So how can you use a tabi'i for tafsir? It's better than fiqh. It's more important than fiqh. Why are you using a tabi'i for tafsir if you don't use them for fiqh? Meaning, how is this a proof? And he says, hada sahih, this is true. This is a good objection. He says, however, what we're talking about is when all of the tabi'een get together on something, then we know this is definitely a proof. This is something called ijma' or consensus. If all of the tabi'i agree on something like Sirat Mustaqim, it all means the same thing, then it becomes a proof. Then we will actually utilize it. Even in fiqh, if all of the tabi'een, they state something, in fiqh we'll use it. As for when they differ on something, so they actually sometimes have completely different opinions, then he says their statements is not a proof necessarily. The mufassir may go against the tabi'een. Right? A mufassir may say, I'm not going to take the statement of the tabi'een. They're tabi'een, I don't have to take their opinion. Sahaba have been proven by Allah as guided, in the sense that Allah has done their tazkiyah. Allah says they are free from blame, but tabi'in don't have that. So sometimes a mufassir, if he doesn't find anything with Sahaba and tabi'in differ, he'll say, I'm not going to take any of their opinion. Here's my opinion. And then he says, وَيُرْجَعُ فِي ذَلِكَ إِلَى لُغَةِ الْقُرْآنِ. Sometimes he'll do tafsir based off of the Arabic language. Sometimes you use another hadith and sunnah. Sometimes he'll just look at phraseology of the Arabs, or he'll find a statement of Sahabi. So he's saying here, tabi'een, using them for tafsir is good. You can do that, but it is not binding, unlike the others. Also, Ahlul Kitab is not binding. Don't think you have to mention that. He mentioned that earlier. It's useless information that you get from Ahlul Kitab most of the time. But now, when we understand, there's one more he's going to mention. We're going to do that tomorrow. It's called Tafsir bil-Ra'i. Basically what we've talked about, how to do tafsir of Quran with Quran. If you cannot do tafsir of Quran with Sunnah, if you cannot do tafsir of Quran with the statement of a Sahabi, then can you take from Ahlul Kitab? Yeah, but you're not going to really benefit too much. Everything's in the Quran anyway. And can you take from the Tabi'een? Yes. When they all agree on something, you have to take it. But if they're differing, you don't have to take it, you can take it. So that's basically the summary of what we've discussed so far. Tomorrow we're going to talk about now the extra stuff from the mind of the Mufassir. So nothing mentioned from Sahaba, Tabi'een, the Mufassir is just pulling it out from his understanding of other aspects. So we'll pause here inshallah and continue. وصلى الله تبارك وتعالى على خير خلق محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين برحمتك يا أرحم الراحمين. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.